Greetings, students. I want to take this opportunity to give you a little bit more information about assessment of students with severe disabilities. So in this session, it's about 15, maybe 18 minutes in length. We'll review a little bit about assessment, some general comments. Then I'll share with you methods and types of assessment. The information for this session was gained from a textbook entitled Instruction of Students with Severe Disabilities, the 7th edition by Snell and Brown. So moving forward, assessment is a process and not a product. And what we mean by that is many times people confuse assessment with evaluation. Evaluation is the end. It's the numeric score. Evaluation is the grade. Evaluation is what you get on your report card. That's the evaluative piece. Assessment is a process that we use every day. We should use assessment. We should use formative assessment every day. Obviously, summative assessment in the end becomes an evaluative, but assessment is an ongoing process. And especially when we are working with children with disabilities, severe disabilities, we should consider assessment to be an ongoing process because we're continually moving toward the end goal. When we are assessing students, there are several instruments and there are procedures that should be considered, and those include the following. When you select the instrument, you want to make sure that it measures what you want it to measure. Is it technically adequate? If it says that it's measuring reading comprehension, then the tool should be measuring reading comprehension and not just vocabulary. So we want to make sure that the instrument that we've selected is the right instrument for that skill. Next piece you want to consider is, are we matching the belief and the view of those engaged in the process? And the instrument and procedures that we select should be a comfort level for the person who's administering them. And the person administering them many times should be the special educator, perhaps the paraprofessional who's been trained by the special educator. But certainly you wouldn't select a tool that you don't believe in or that you don't feel comfortable using without some training. The next piece to consider is the intent of the assessment. What's the purpose? Why are we assessing the student? Is it a formative daily assessment? So certainly we wouldn't administer the Burgons, which is an academic assessment, for a formal assessment. But we would want to ensure that whatever we pick, we're matching the intent of the assessment with what we want to show at the end. What is it that we want to gain from the assessment? And lastly, we always need to consider this with children that have IEPs. And that is, are we conducting the assessment in a manner that's appropriate for that particular student? And we can certainly look to students who are impaired in some capacity. We wouldn't give them an assessment that measures something that they're unable to show us what they know. So we want to make sure that we've selected a measure to assess them that really gives us a true picture of who that person is and what their capacity is at that point in time. It's a snapshot. So how do we assess our students? The next piece I want to talk about a little is the methods. What are the methods that we use? And when we work with children who have severe disabilities, there are 3 basic methods that are used to assess them. One is through direct teaching. Second is observation in the natural environment, which is highly preferred. And then thirdly are interviews. And I'll spend a little bit of time on each one of those. Direct testing, this allows the teacher to set up a scenario that might be a situation where a student could give us information as to whether they can perform the skill. An example might be a child who is learning to buy something from the store. And the teacher might put everything on a piece of paper and write the story, the problem, and have the child show with paper and pencil how much money they might need for that particular purchase. Or they might even give them the money and ask them to show what they would need for the purchase. It certainly would provide us with information as to whether they could perform the skill. Can they count the coins? Can they make change? Do they know what to do? But what we do know is it is limiting because it's a contrived situation. It's not in the actual setting that would occur. And so it is limiting in that respect. So observation in the natural environment, as I've said, is the preferred method because the teacher can observe more than just the skill. So more than just counting the money and making change could be observed if the child were taken to the grocery store and were able to make the purchase at the store, because we're looking at a wider range of related behaviors. Yes, the targeted skill is making the change and knowing how to purchase the item, but there are other tasks that are involved in that. There's the task of looking at finding the item in the store. Then once they find the item in the store, which item exactly would they choose? Would they choose one that costs more, one that costs less? Then it's getting the item and physically putting it in the cart, or having someone help them to put the item in the cart. Then it's having the confidence to go, where do they go to pay for it? They would have to know where you would pay for it and what that involves. The skill of putting it on the conveyor belt. So all of these related behaviors to making a purchase are observations that can be made in the natural environment that cannot be made by having the child just make cash and show that they can do the exchange for money with a problem on a piece of paper and with coins. So the observations themselves should sample a range of relevant settings. So we might have the child make a purchase in the grocery store, a large grocery store. We might have the person make the purchase at a convenience store, and what would be the difference there? So we would have two different types of settings in that respect. Now, the disadvantage of observations in the natural environment is that the child may not display the behavior at the time that you want to assess them. So whether this is because they don't show the capacity at that point in time, whether there's another behavior that's impacting them adversely, or maybe they've just chosen not to perform it. So it might not happen at the time that you choose to assess it. The third method, now we've talked about direct testing. We've talked about observations in the natural environment as being the preferred. And lastly, we would discuss and remember that interviews are a method of gathering information or assessing. Interviews should be conducted with those people that work with or know the student, which could range from the teacher, the paraprofessional, might be the recess aide if it's a goal that you're working on, a socialization goal at recess, or you might think that the parents, certainly they would have some information that they could share on how the child is doing on that goal, and you could gather information from them. It could be a formal interview. It could be an informal. We know that informals tend to be more useful because they're gathering, they're in that mode of assessment. They're gathering the information that is necessary to help plan instruction. The major disadvantage to interviews is that they tend to be more subjective and not as accurate. It's not concrete data. We're getting involved with what people think as well as what they feel, not necessarily what they objectively observe. And it's difficult. We're all people. We're all humans. We have perspectives. So that's a disadvantage of interviews. But again, it's a way to gather information. Interviews can be conducted face-to-face, F2F, through telephone, or many people use smartphones, or a written questionnaire, which so often are sent now through emails, and so much correspondence happens in that capacity. I would ask you to consider these aspects of interviewing, should you choose to use this method, which you will as a special educator, that you think about your questions very carefully before you ask them. You should have your interview questions planned in advance. You might even ask them to a colleague, or to your paraprofessional, or to another individual, a mentor, another individual that can help you think through the questions so that you have, you're getting the information that you want to glean from the interview. Listen more and talk less. And that's very difficult for some of us, to listen more and talk less, because we want to jump right in. But remember, you're gathering information. If the person allows you to record them, of course you have to give them full knowledge that you're recording, and you have to have their permission. You could record them, and then you would have that information to listen to. Or even a video recording if you were at that level of a more formal interview. Again, you'd have to have the permission to do that. But you want to listen. You want to use questions that allow you to listen more. Use open-ended questions, not leading questions that take a person down a path that makes it a yes/no, or that they answer it in the direction that you want it to be answered. You need to be as objective as you can with your questions. Staying broad and less focused, again, more open-ended, really helps that. You also want to take good notes. Again, I mentioned recording, which is always a good option if you can do that. If not, you take good notes, especially if it's face-to-face, because the nonverbal that you receive in a face-to-face is probably more strong, and I know that it is more strong than what the person actually says. So you want to watch their facial gestures, their posture. Again, the nonverbal is so important. All right, let's talk for a few minutes about types of assessment. When we think about types of assessment, there are different ways to categorize assessment. We think of it as norm referenced versus criterion referenced. I'll talk about that a little bit more. IQ tests versus developmental scales versus achievement. What does that mean when we think about that whole spectrum of testing? And I will talk a little bit more in depth about that aspect of assessment. Group assessment versus individual assessment. The types of assessment that we tend to give to our students who have severe disabilities is individual assessment. Why? Because they have individual plans. There are times that we do give group assessments, very rarely, but there are times when we would give a group assessment. That's an aspect of assessment that I won't go in depth with in this presentation. Standardized versus teacher constructed. Many more of your assessments will be teacher constructed based upon skills, but certainly there will be some standardized testing along the way. And standardized tests are tend to be norm referenced. They tend to have high validity and reliability, and they, obviously are used, but not to the extent that teacher constructed are, because it's an individual plan that we're following. And the last point about assessment, behavioral versus academic versus environmental, I'll spend a little bit of time on that as well. So there are three aspects when we think about assessment that I'll talk about a little bit more in additional slides. First, norm referenced versus criterion referenced. Norm referenced makes you think of the mean, the mode, the median. It makes you think of stay nines. Norm reference means we're comparing our disabled students to non-disabled students of the same age. This is the PASA, norm referenced. It's used to determine the extent of the deviation from the normal population. So we're taking a look at how far are they away from that normal population. Those are given when we look at the PASA, and the PASA is given, well, right now the PASA is given once a year, and that's the alternate assessment for the PSSA. The criterion reference, these are the types of assessments that we use diagnostically. I like to use the word diagnostic because you are diagnosing. You're taking a look at how the child has performed on this assessment, and you're saying this is what the child needs to do in order to move along the continuum to achieve this goal. So you use it for instruction, you use it to plan. These are criterion reference. It's based on a set of criteria. We want to know, what does the child know based upon this set of skills or standards? So it's criterion referenced. Another way to look at assessment, we sometimes, when we're looking at assessing children with paper pencil tasks, we look at what's the difference between IQ tests, developmental scales, achievement tests, and where does that fall in the continuum of assessing. So let's talk a little bit about those. IQ tests are the WISC, the Wechsler. We use them to diagnose intellectual disability. And you know the range. Anything 70 or below 70 is considered intellectually disabled. The old term is mentally retarded, MR range. And the low average is between 70 and 80. Even up to, some people go up to the low 80s. When you hit 100, 100 is middle average range for IQ, for intellectual capacity. These folks are average learners. 110 is above average. 125 is considered above average. 130 is considered gifted in Pennsylvania. 125 is considered gifted in the state of Maryland. So therein lies one of the complexities with IQ tests. It's that they're not an accurate measure of what the child knows. And, you know, quite frankly, let's look at the autistic population. Let's look at those students who have autism, specifically looking at savants. We know that savants are individuals who have a skill in a certain area that is above and beyond their skill set in every other developmental area. So children, people who are savants, tend to be musically inclined, mathematically inclined, or have a strong set and head for numbers and calendar, and can recite those. Think of the movie Rain Man. If you haven't seen the movie Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman, you actually should go see that. Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise. An excellent story about a man who has autism who was gifted with numbers. So that doesn't tell us the whole story. His IQ may have shown us a below 70 range, but we know he has exceptionality in other areas. And the other thing about IQ tests too, it really flies in the face of Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, and that's that everyone has a set of intelligences. There are 9 areas that a person can demonstrate his or her level of intelligence. And it's not just in the area of reading and mathematics and spatial reasoning, which tend to be the IQ tests, the standard IQ test. The other piece with IQ tests, and I'm not a big fan of them, is the misuse of results. When we use numbers to just flatly target students. I know a parent whose daughter has since graduated from high school, and this child had Down syndrome, and she had intellectual disabilities, but the school would look at her IQ and say, oh, this child needs life skills based upon her IQ. However, she could read, she could write, She could do mathematical equations. She could fold the laundry, cook. She could do all of the home skills. She could do personal care skills. So why are we looking at that number? All right, so unfortunately, systems tend to look at the numbers and we start to categorize kids rather than looking at the kids and saying, hey, what can this student do? Where are our expectations for this child? So we could talk about that a long time. Let's move on. Developmental scales. The developmental approach was really hot in the early 70s. And this is where we take a look at what the child's mental age is based upon the age at which a normally developing child would perform that skill. Now, I'll tell you, that's okay. It gives us an idea of where they are developmentally, and it helps us to move them along the continuum. But there's a point in time when you have to look beyond that continuum and say, okay, is this an appropriate expectation for this child? At what point do we keep moving? Because we know chronologically and socially that child is at a higher age, and we need to incorporate that and not just have them work at the developmental level. And so everything has to be taken into consideration when we look at developmental scales. It gives us a range. It certainly gives us good information, but I would caution that we take a look at all aspects of that child and not just where they are in that particular area of development and their cognitive functioning. Lastly, achievement tests. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about achievement tests. And in achievement tests specifically, again, the PASA, which you're going to do a 2.5-2-hour session on, watch that information. So that will be a piece that you'll find more about. The PASA is the Pennsylvania Alternate System of Assessment, and it identifies the critical essence of each of the standards in reading and math, translates them into functional applications of skills relevant to students, our students with severe disabilities. So you'll learn a little bit more about that. It's a snapshot. It's a once-a-year assessment. The Brigance is typically used with children. The Brigance is, the formal name is Brigance Diagnostic Inventory of Early Development, and the Brigance Comprehensive Inventory of Basic Skills Revised. Those two tend to be used with children. Specifically, they are checklists that you look at to see if a child has achieved a certain level. And once that is given, you have that information as a teacher that you can start to plan more curriculum-based assessments with the child. It just gives you, again, another snapshot and another picture of where that child is performing. Okay, lastly, when we talk about types of assessment, I told you there were 3 areas that I wanted to touch upon. This slide highlights 3 specific areas when we think about how we are assessing these children, and we are assessing them academically. And I just mentioned that, IQ, developmental scales, and we also use achievement tests. We assess them academically. We assess them academically with criterion-based testing. So there are many ways that we can assess children in that academic environment. Do they understand cognitively how to perform the skill? Another way that we assess children is behaviorally. And behaviorally, in MED 545, which is a classroom management class that is part of this program, we spend time on FBAs, functional behavioral assessments. We spend time on behavioral intervention plans, and we spend time on positive behavior support, because it's a way of looking at the child's behavior so that he or she can function optimally in society, in the classroom, in the community. It's not about if the child is misbehaving or not following the rules, because every behavior tells us something about that child, especially when we're looking at the child's sensitivity to the environment. So behaviorally, we need to look at the behaviors that impact that child's ability to learn. The last type of assessment that we're going to talk just a little bit about is environment. And environmental assessment is when we look at, first, it's multidimensional in focus. And we're taking a look at the fact that it's critical to measure the children in their educational programs to determine how they function in different environments. How do they function in the classroom? How do they function when they're at lunch? How do they function when they're at home? The different environmental influences that impact their ability to learn. So we'd have to do an assessment of their environment. It's the environmental assessment. And we look at the ecological factors that impact on the child. And we look at where the child would be performing the task when we look at environmental assessment. Again, these three, it's just another way of looking at assessment. In what areas do we look at it? I'm going to end with a slide that I started with and say thank you for taking the opportunity to listen to this. I hope it's helped to clear up some aspects of assessment, and I look forward to talking with you again soon. I hope you have a great day. If you have questions, please let me know. Thank you. Goodbye.